Hello, I am Stefan Akam, the Hirshhorn Chief Curator, and it is my privilege to welcome you today for the discussion with artists Camille and Akwetey Orraca-Tetteh, and our Associate Curator of Media and Performance Art, Marina Isgro. We are grateful, very grateful to Akwetey and Camille to be with us today. One is in Mexico, the other in Munich. We're all here together. What brings us together is the presentation of their work, Grosse Fatigue, in the exhibition In the Beginning, that is online, and the first chapter online until November 1st. So please go see this, Grosse Fatigue. It is seriously one of the most significant and greatest works of our time. Please come back to us November 18th. We will have a discussion with Keanu Williams and around his work that will be in the second chapter of In the Beginning, Meditations on the Making of America. And now on to Camille and Akwetey Orraca-Tetteh. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you, Stefan. Thanks everyone for being here today. I am really delighted to be in conversation with Camille and Akwetey Orraca-Tetteh. As Stefan mentioned, Camille's video Grosse Fatigue, for which Akwetey voiced the soundtrack, is currently on view for just a few more days in our virtual exhibition In the Beginning, Media, Art, and History. So please visit our website and take a look. We will also put a link in the chat. So Grosse Fatigue is a 13-minute video that critically examines the enduring human ambition to represent the totality of the world, an aspiration that underpins many museum collections. Camille researched the film here at the Smithsonian and showed it at the 55th Venice Biennale in 2013, where she was awarded the Silver Lion. It has since been included in exhibitions globally, including the Hirshhorn's 2017 show, The Message, New Media Works. I know I was blown away when I saw it, and I'm so thrilled that it's in the Hirshhorn collection and that Camille has given us permission to screen it online. But Camille and Akwetey's interests in history and origin stories also extend far beyond Grosse Fatigue. Camille, who joins us tonight from Munich, is a French artist who moves seamlessly between film, painting, drawing, sculpture, and installation, in work that asks us to question what it means to be at once a private individual and a global subject. She won the 2014 Namjoon Paik Art Award and was the inaugural winner of the Edvard Munch Art Award in 2015. Akwetey is a Ghanaian-American artist currently based in Mexico City. In his practice, he employs painting, video, and performance to reimagine cultural and personal mythologies in the digital era. So welcome, Camille and Akwetey. Please feel free to turn on your cameras now. Hello. There we go.
Hello, Marina.
So I thought today we could kind of kick off our conversation with a discussion of Grosse Fatigue, and then we'll take a closer look at what each of you has been working on since then. And we'll end with a Q&A. So if you have any questions, just hit that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And they will be sent to us, and then we'll address them in the last 10 or 15 minutes. So why don't we start with a clip from Grosse Fatigue? I think we have about the first 2.5 minutes of the film. So if you want to turn off your cameras.
In the beginning were quantum fluctuations. In the beginning, the universe was a black egg where heaven and earth were mixed together. In the beginning, there was an explosion. In the beginning, a dark ocean washed on the shores of nothingness and licked the edges of night. In the beginning was the eternal night Han. In the beginning, before all things, there was Amma, and he rested upon nothing. In the beginning, Ta, the demiurge, born from the essential ocean. In the beginning, the fabric of space-time unfurled, it unflated. In the beginning, the atoms were formed. In the beginning, a giant cobra floated on the waters. In the beginning, everything was still. There was no beginning. In the beginning and in the void, the oldest of old gods was formed. The world had no time, no shape, and no life, except in the mind of the creator. In the beginning, the word already was. There was no world then, only the white, yellow, blue, black, silver, and red mists floating in the air. In the beginning was only the sky above, and water, and marshland below. In the beginning was nucleosynthesis. And when the universe became transparent to light, then the Milky Way took form. Then there was no need for light on Zamboling, for the gods emitted a pure light from their own bodies. Then the creator was in the form of a man without bones. Then the gravity of galaxies slowed the expansion of the universe. Then were units of matter. Then Pangu died and parts of his body became parts of the universe. Then there was recombination, local contraction. Then the supreme god of Ometioto, being both masculine and feminine, spawned 4 children. Then Ra created his wife Hathor, with whom he had a son, Horus, who married Isis. Then Atum took his penis in hand to obtain the pleasure of orgasm thereby. Then Ayuasas was lady of the vulva and hand of God. Then Ogo introduced disorder into the world by committing incest with his mother Earth. Then the first menstrual blood came from this union, as well as Yeban and Andumbulu, the spirits of the underworld. And there was violent relaxation.
Okay, I think we can turn our cameras back on. Here we go. So that was just the first 2.5 minutes. Again, the whole thing is online if you'd like to watch it through the 31st. So Camille, I wonder if you could just kick us off by talking a little bit about how you started work on this video and the kind of research that you were engaged in at the Smithsonian. So in the clip and in the whole piece, we're seeing shots of the Natural History Museum's collection storage, even some footage of the Smithsonian offices. Could you just talk about what your experience was like researching there?
So the Smithsonian is actually the point of origin. It's in the beginning of Gross Fatigue, there was a Smithsonian because when I moved to the United States, an artist named Douglas Rose, who had done the Artist Research Fellowship, suggested I apply for the Research Artist Fellowship. And so I decided to apply, but he mentioned to me, you have to be really careful because I know you're very curious and you're gonna want, like me, to research all the different museums, all the different collection, and it's really overwhelming. So you need to be very focused and have a very focused topic. Also, in general, the curator at the Smithsonian don't like when the research is too broad, so you should be really focused and connect maybe 2 or 3 institutions, but not more. And I went on the Smithsonian website and I started to research the website, and I was so overwhelmed and impressed by the website of the Smithsonian that I decided I wanted to work on the Smithsonian globally, and through the Smithsonian, the aspiration of the Universal Museum to collect and represent the totality, and how this could be approached from a sort of artist point of view, connecting it with more personal drive, thinking about the museum not as an entity that is abstract and is neutral, but more as a sort of human, a person or a group of persons who are driven by a certain anxiety, a certain type of neurosis, which in the case of the museum would be hoarding specifically. And so that was really the way to approach it. And I used elements I had of analysis that were more kind of actually type of psychoanalysis around the hoarding to approach the topic. And I tried to reduce a little bit the number of museum research, but it was still like the topic of the research was still like the globally, like the Smithsonian as an institution who has the ambition to represent everything. And the research originally was supposed to actually be on a period of like 10 years. And I wanted to do a slideshow and to do like a very long film that would also like invite other artists and be some like, I thought about the project of the film derived to the research as something very different than what gross fatigue became. But I got invited by Massimiliano Gioni to participate in the Venice Biennial, and he absolutely wanted the film to be ready, and so it kind of like compressed and stressed the research a little bit. But I also felt there was maybe something actually more. It became more about disease and more about neurosis and more about manic. Because I was myself in a sort of state of manic research as well. And so that's also what the title comes from.
Right, gross fatigue. Yeah, so you made this in 2013. I want to ask you now to think a little bit about it sort of in our moment when many of us are really thinking intensely about issues around collecting. So ethical questions like repatriation, provenance research, and so on. I wonder if you could talk about how you see gross fatigue as participating in these conversations and maybe what kind of critique it offers.
Obviously, I mean, the title gross fatigue was chosen as a bit as a sort of like attenuation for something else. The real meaning of gross fatigue is actually depression. In France, we say gross fatigue means a depression. But also I was thinking about the idea of like resting, like the feeling of being exhausted and the activity of resting as a sort of attenuation of death. And to me, the museum, I mean, while I was doing the research about this manic activity of collecting of the museum and the roots of it, like what is at the origin of it, because obviously, I mean, it's not just that the museum has a colonial past and that the objects were collected on mostly dead bodies, but also the museum is made out of dead bodies too. And there is still something like 73,500 specimens that are collected and that are still not classified and identified. I'm talking about like animal specimen. So it means like the amount of object the museum has been collecting is way out of proportion to what it can actually digest in terms of information to process. And so there is, when I say the museum as some kind of hoarding disease, it's not just a personal analysis, it's a fact. And so the idea behind the film was also to show that through Google and the also manic activity of collecting images or making database, making also the museum collection accessible online, there was a continuation of that move. And that even though we feel we live in a different era, which is a digital era, it is still the continuation of the, I would say, the anxious desire of the museum to replace the fear of death by object. And so for me, the idea of gross fatigue was very much to talk about that, to talk about our fear of death and how it manifests through the activity of collecting objects, but also how it has had the consequences of death too, through, of course, the way the objects were collected for anthropological collection, but also natural collection, where it's even more obvious, especially with the animals, like the scene in gross fatigue where you see the animal have been not only they are dead animals, but they are like folded animals. And so I think there is also in gross fatigue, I didn't want the film to address that in a way that was too literal, because of course also once you say things that clearly, then they stop to be provoking. And because it becomes black, it becomes white, it becomes a category in itself. And in the film, I was trying to keep the energy of the manic energy to be the energy of the film itself. So it's not just an accusation of the museum of like a person, like it would be me, but more like a sort of like a collective acknowledgement of our responsibility into being fascinated and participating to this manic activity.
Right. Well, thinking about that manic energy, a lot of it is about the sort of sequencing of the images too that you see in the film. And as I watch it, I see almost several different ways that the images are organized. So sometimes there are these purely visual organizational schemes. You know, you cut from your splattered pants on the metro to the Pollock splatters, or from a circle on a piece of paper to a bald head and then a globe. At other times, there are these correspondences between kind of the spoken word and what you're seeing on screen, but sometimes they don't match. So I wonder if you could talk about how you approach that question of sequencing or editing.
It was a very, it's, I think, probably the most interesting aspect of the film that isn't really often said or often described, because it would be probably too complicated. But I started by making a huge folder on Dropbox, which like very different category. It would go from dirtiness to anorexia to hoarding to people writing and drawing in their beds to American expressionism. I couldn't explain why those categories existed. They are born out of the, while I was doing the research, I was like intuitively having those images in my head, and I started collecting images about it. And so once I had this sort of like Dropbox, I was actually going through those images regularly. There was also like a collection of color charts, for example. Because of course the color chart is an image of totality, but sometimes it would take a little bit of time for me to connect the dots, like to understand why, for example, the image of anorexia, how does it relate to the desire to possess everything? And so those connections I made a little bit later, once I had finished the research, and I had like started to make those diagrams that I published in the book Elephant Child, where I tried to create a sort of like a chronology that associates the different evolution of animals with the different evolution moment of technology, with the different moment in the human life, from like childhood to old age.
Mm-hmm. Right. Great. Well, I think at this point we should also bring in Akwetey, who's been waiting very patiently. So a lot of the power of this work, everyone says, is the soundtrack, and especially the very precise way that the image and sound meet. So certain stresses in the way that the poem is spoken will coincide with cuts in the film and so on. So Akwetey, I wonder if you could just tell me a little bit about how you initially got involved in this project, maybe what your background had been up to that point and how you met Camille.
Sure, yeah. I had always been very much interested in story, in narrative, and this idea of performative identity, you know, and the ways in which, as a structure, you know, it can be very malleable. So growing up, I would always invested time in theater. You know, I had worked at the Public Theater years ago, and also in film, you know, in the realm of, you know, either script reading or actual performance. So around the time that Gross Fatigue was in creation, I had just come off tour with my twin brother, Aku. Camille mentioned this idea of neurosis or manic energy, the idea of having kind of a set piece, you know, this idea of a musical performance, traveling around the world, as much as it offers an opportunity for creative expression. There are certain routines and certain guidelines that kind of push that medium forward. So in coming off tour, I decided it would be really advantageous for me to kind of channel that manic energy perhaps into a more experimental form of communicating on stage. So I began a series of experimental performances at various venues that were less focused on this idea of a complete execution of, say, a musical song or performance, and focused more on this kind of the idea of a more extemporaneous communication or improvisational communication. And a mutual friend of ours, curator Clara Meister, I think she's in Berlin now at the Gropius Bau. She'd come to one of those performances, and also performance of my music project. And Camille, I believe, was in the audience as well. And I think from that time, some conversations began. And I think we quickly realized, or rather Camille realized, that perhaps the vein of interest, in terms of where I'm coming from creatively, performatively, might have some import, with her new project, So we kind of began from that conversation.
Right. So last time we spoke, you both told me about the recording process and how things changed kind of on both sides as you collaborated. So, the images may have changed, the pacing may have changed, but also the voicing of certain sections may have changed. Could you tell us that story a little bit?
Yeah, very, very interesting. One of the reasons I was really drawn to Camille's practice is the kind of bending of the lines, or reimagining of the lines between mediums, and how to engage with that to create a fresh new piece of work. So the idea of collected stories and narratives that she had from around the world manifesting themselves in a kind of new patchwork, I found very interesting. So in going into the studio, there was, to some extent, some guidelines in terms of thinking about how to perform the story, as it were. But in addition to that, and for what it's worth, I'm glad that it took some new form, but this idea of involving some kind of improvisational or autonomic expression into the work was very important to me, to kind of, as Camille mentioned before, this idea of maintaining some kind of provocation, into new work. So when we did work together, it was very interesting. We had a very thick glass in between us. So the idea of sound communication was nil, but in terms of visually and the physicality of how to, say, communicate or guide the experience of that recording was very interesting. There was a lot of gestures with the hands, it was very, I would almost say, balletic in the way that we were kind of communicating between glass,
Right. Yeah, you talked about Camille sort of conducting through that glass wall as you performed. But maybe you could also talk about that sort of moment toward the end of the soundtrack when the voice changes a little bit and becomes a little bit more song-like, a little bit more vulnerable. I think that was something that changed during the recording. Is that right?
Yeah, I guess an unintended consequence of being very comfortable collaborating with another artist, the texture and kind of the momentum of certain parts of the work, we're familiar with this part of the work where we're going through the different classifications of species, and then at a moment's rest, there's somewhat of a pause. And the phrase that really struck me, this phrase, and Ra was lonely. For some reason, it was really kind of struck me as a moment of change in the narrative. The idea of loneliness, being a person alone in a place has some sense of solace, some sense of quietude. And I think from that, without any kind of intention, my whole demeanor, my whole voice, and kind of the character, you know, being pushed forward, I think ultimately changed and became you know, emblematic of that, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. One more question for Camille, actually for both of you. Camille, I know you initially imagined this work as being shown solely in a physical gallery space, but during this sort of period of lockdowns, you've been allowing some online screenings. I wonder if you could just talk about how your reasoning about that has changed and maybe what it's been like to view this work online.
Yeah, I want to say that the reason why I didn't accept the streaming online before wasn't for anything related to some kind of like property or control, but more because the film is so dense in terms of like images, and it is mimicking the computer window. So being shown on a computer as sort of like destroyed part of the attraction and magic of it, which is to be a blown up computer screen. So this is why I've been always insisting on presentation of Grosse Fatigue to be in a cinema room with a very specific format of screen, because I know that some images, for example, when there is the masturbation scene, the image becomes so small that if you look in a computer, you cannot actually see the image that is at the center because it becomes too small. So this is why I've been resisting the streaming in the past.
Yeah.
And obviously, I mean, it originally it came from MoMA, the request to stream it, and the program was very consistent. I enjoyed the idea of being shown along all this other video work that I admire, and it also felt like, because the situation of looking at the world through the screen had become, there was an awareness of it. In the past, there was no awareness that we were actually seeing the world through the screen, and the way the world would appear to us was in the form of excess, and that it was also something that has some emotional implication and distress and anxiety connected to it. But with COVID crisis, this awareness became more like prominent and widely shared, and so it felt like it was actually the good moment, and it was possible to stream it, and the message of the film still to be understood.
Great. Okay, well, we're getting some really great questions about Grosse Fatigue, but I think we should save them to the end. I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about Akwetey's work, sort of outside and beyond Grosse Fatigue and beyond music, because your practice is extremely wide-ranging. I thought we could spend a few minutes talking about maybe some recent paintings that operate kind of within this tradition of history painting. So again, related to the themes that are coming out in the Black Box exhibition. So why don't we start with suspension?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. So you've cited Caravaggio and the Conversion of St. Paul as a model for this painting. And there's that kind of similar sense of drama, sort of arrested movement, this blinding flash of light. But you're also bringing in some comic book imagery. So I wonder if you could talk about your use of those disparate sources here and how they work in combination.
Right, of course, yeah. Interestingly enough, the phrase violent relaxation from Grosse Fatigue, from the video, has a lot of resonance with me, I guess, in my painting as well. This idea of movement is very, has a strong current in my work. And also this idea of redressing or somehow creating a historical imaginarium wherein either documented history or moments of history or conversations around specific points in history can be reintroduced, given context and perhaps provoked in a new way. So the idea of referring to a Baroque era painting, Caravaggio's Conversion of St. Paul, was very interesting to me in that we're looking at a character previously before he's been anointed, as the saint, this idea of someone who's going through some kind of transformation, so whereas in the story of the conversion, Saul is on the road to Damascus and he is blinded by the light above, understood as the light of Christ or the light of God. This idea of being arrested such that he's literally not able to stand on his own. And in that case, the power of divination, right, is literally taking him off his rocker. So in this work, I'm kind of supplanting this idea of the Saul character, considering the way in which we understand justice, or the way in which in various societies around the world, from wherever we're standing, from the side of the oppressed, from the side of those who are in authority, and from those who potentially have the will or power or desire to help or assist. This idea that we too are arrested and somehow caught, in this suspended period of time wherein the idea of justice or the idea of liberty is always placed center stage, but this kind of high, gross, intense activity of how that's manifested in real life in societies, in this case in America, how that plays out.
Yeah, so you told me that a specific kind of incident in the news got you started on this painting. So maybe you want to talk about that a little?
Yeah, I think we started to see, well, obviously we didn't start to see, but the momentum of the Black Lives Matter movement in response to atrocities committed around the country really sat heavy with me. This painting, in addition to the reference to Baroque art, was also referencing an incident in Dallas, Texas. A young Black woman and her friends had gone swimming in a local pool. And I believe a police officer had accosted the young woman and her friends, and without merit began assaulting them. And oftentimes when we think of the narratives and the conversations around brutality and who are the perpetrators and who are the victims, oftentimes as adult or the culture of communicating or talking about these atrocities, sometimes we forget that the way we exhibit these conversations or the way we talk about them are seen and understood by the youth. So this idea of painting a picture to give context to this fight for justice and liberty, but all the while having the sensibility that we're also the forebearers of new stories and new histories for the youth. So I wanted to be able to highlight or show the way in which, the catastrophe or the disaster of how we engage with some of these topics is very vibrant and very vivid, for children around the world. So in considering how we can present and give context to history, but also like provoke, as we've talked about, new ways of seeing amidst this kind of chaos.
Right. So let's go to the next painting, which goes a little further back in time. This is called The Abolitionists. And here you're thinking about Reconstruction era America. So could you just talk us through the structure of the painting and the various sort of fragmented bodies that we're seeing here?
Right. So in thinking about the structure formally, this idea of foregrounding moments in history is very important in my work. So we're looking at a young Black couple. This piece is highlighted around Reconstruction era, so 1865 America. This scene is off the coast of Virginia in the Chesapeake Bay. So essentially, when we think about the history of oppressed or marginalized people around the world, not only in America, I tend to think of three different veins of thought. You know, this idea of the atrocities committed onto a group of people, then also the idea of how these atrocities are processed, you know, and then also this idea of the imagination or the cultivation of a future outlook, you know, how these histories can be transformed and changed. So the idea of working with the theme of abolition has a lot of weight to me. So in the foreground, you'll see a young group of children who, in a sense, represent the future, you know, represent hope. And this idea of this couple standing firmly in the center of the work. And then off into the distance, we see slightly out of frame, this idea of he who is kind of conjoining, you know, with the plight of this group to kind of affect or initiate, you know, some kind of redress to actually implement change. And at the top of the painting, kind of looking down on the scene, again, the symbol of liberty, the American flag.
Right. So maybe we can talk about a few paintings together in the interest of time. Yeah. So this painting, the next one, Blue Bathers, the next one after that, which is a very recent work called The Sport of Getting Along in a Crisis, and the next one, Whitewater Weekend. They're all taking place either in bodies of water or adjacent to bodies of water. So I wonder if you could talk about kind of what is your sort of repeated attraction to water as a motif? What is it doing in these paintings? Or if you want to zoom in on one, feel free.
No, I can talk about them collectively. I had a really amazing conversation with curator Ndubwisi Ezolawumba. He's the curator of African art at the New Orleans Museum of Art. And we spoke in brief about this topic specifically, about how water is represented in the African tradition and through the diaspora, water being a compound that symbolizes strength and knowledge, and also prosperity, but also water as a kind of holding element for the past, you know. So when we think of, say, even the triangle of the Atlantic slave trade between Europe, the northern tip of South America, and then also the West Indies and North America, water has a very profound impact on the way that history has been drawn out. So in my work, I've found incidentally that this has become a great holding place to have these conversations about talking about the past, present, and future, and also to kind of understand or communicate this idea that water is about transformation and movement, in a contemporary sense. You know, you're looking at a real-time story that is constantly in evolution.
That's great, thank you. So I think just so that we get everything in, we should transition to Camille, but we can also come back to talking about Akwetey's paintings in the Q&A. So if anyone has questions, feel free to send those in. So I want to shift now to thinking about history and origins from a very different perspective as we look at Camille's most recent body of work. So over the past several years, you've been making these paintings, watercolors, drawings, and sculptures that address motherhood from anthropological and psychoanalytic perspectives. So maybe if we go back to that first one, there's a whole series that you're working on having to do with breast pumping. And these images are unusual, not just because they depict breast pumping, which is, you know, something that is rarely visualized in art, but also because they show a mother nursing without her child also present in the scene. So I wonder if you could talk about that and how you came to this subject.
Yeah, it started a little bit as a sort of like irritation with the topic. I often work with things that I'm feeling uncomfortable with. And so this was something I felt uncomfortable with. I felt like the breast pump was an object that is a little bit at the conflict or at the node. I don't know how to say.
Yeah,
it hides up different issues. And on one hand, it represents the possibility for women to work and still breastfeed their own children with breast milk. On another hand, it also, I think, is a machine that is plugged to the body, and it by this only just by this fact that the machine extract nutrition's element from the body, it actually objectified the body that is the source of food, and it reduced it to actually a source of food. So it felt like a very ambivalent object. Of course, there is also the resonance with the animal situation too, that the animal too have breast pump machines like the cow milk. And so it just, the association with us as animal is way more obvious when you consider, you know, parenting through this machine, it felt. And there was also a sort of like element of disgust, but also an element of like fascination with the sound of the machine itself and the cyclical nature of it, and the way it actually increases the sort of like dynamic of productivity, which also kind of like go on the other direction, which is a direction where it becomes a little bit irritating when it starts to participate too much in the capitalistic narrative and the way parenting need to participate to this construction of like effectivity, productivity, and how motherhood is in a way become like totally included in this sort of like diktat of productivity. And it kind of like also becomes the images of the crush, what people in the press call it, the crush, which is the overburden of like imperatives that falls on women when they have children, having to both be performative at work and performative as mother, and of course this situation not being possible at the same time. Yeah. And ended up in a feeling of losing at everything.
Right. You mentioned the issue of animals. I think a few images down we have, Amy, if you want to go like three or, oh, there we go. This one I just love. Here you do see the child, which is unusual for the series, but the mother's face has almost turned into a bird. Yeah. Is that, am I reading that correctly?
Yeah, and the child is actually using the head of a dog as a way to be at the right height.
That's amazing. And then there's another one, I think, with the deer that are nursing. Also amazing. I love that. But I want to go back maybe to that second image in the series to think about the medium of watercolor. So you're often mixing watercolor with other media like acrylic, and some of them are purely watercolor. But it seems to me that you're really playing with kind of the fluidity or the liquidity of the paint. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on kind of how the medium intersects with the subject matter here, which is also sort of about, you know, fluids or liquids.
Yeah, there is something about having a child that is really leaking, you know, that is really like trashy, I don't know how to say, like dirty, or like that is like splashing. I've always been fascinated by the Gutai movement, the Japanese expressionism. And I always felt like, oh, if I start painting one day, I mean, this is for me like one of the most achieved paintings. And so I also wrote a thesis actually while at school on the connection between action films and Japanese expressionism. And so I really, it resonated as a very important reference for me in a moment where the body failed and everything is leaking out, to think about expressionism. Yeah. And the use of a very liquid material, but also a sort of rejection of the white, because usually I love to have a very simple white background. But for this series of work, there was something unsatisfying with the whiteness. And that's also how I understood that maybe it was a moment to start painting and stop drawing. I mean, even though the final paintings are still incorporating watercolor and technical of drawing. I mean, I don't really know if actually it makes sense to make the difference between drawing and painting so much in my case, because I'm using calligraphy brushes, and so I think this dichotomy, this separation between painting and drawing doesn't really make so much sense, actually.
Interesting, the calligraphy brushes. So even painting, drawing, writing, you could talk about.
Yes.
And we'll get to some of the paintings that are about sort of language, I think, in a little bit. But first, let's just look at the two ultrasound images. These are from a series called Soon. Because I think this really connects again with this question of technique. Here you can really see how the paint is like soaking into that paper and getting absorbed. And I wonder if you could just talk about these. Were you thinking about sort of the question of becoming, or how are you thinking about liquidity in this series?
It's I was interested in loss of control. I feel like a lot of my activity of drawings before were oriented towards a sort of like perfect gestures that looks completely casual and completely laid back, but is actually very carefully trained into. And with this series of work, I also, maybe because I was experiencing the loss of control over my own body, I was interested to kind of like experiment more towards like the effect of water. And working with very, very heavy paper and with the ink, I was really struck by how close to photography quickly it became. And so I was interested in thinking that water is an element of photographic images, especially if you think about the ecography or all the different techniques of the photomedical, which have always fascinated me. It's actually some shot of like a camera pila in my most recent film, and all the images of like inside the body is one of the things that I'm really interested right now.
Yeah, that's great. So let's go to the next body of work. I think these are all from Systems of Attachment, which is kind of about the relationship between mother and child. Several images that we're seeing here are of the mother seeming to devour her child, or the child inserting its head into the mother's mouth. So can I ask you like how you're thinking about orality or the mouth in these images?
I mean, it's I was really fascinated with the experience of like parenting and like observing small children by the way they are fascinated by how we speak before they can speak. And I think they are fascinated by our mouths, and they want to put their fingers in the mouth because they want to understand how we do it, because they are eager to be able to speak their mind to and express their feelings and disagreements sometimes. And so I thought that for me it was one of the most interesting mental space to project in working in this series, is to think about how do we represent perception where things like, how do we join this space where words doesn't exist yet and they are things,
right?
And so this became really one of the elements. But then I think the aspiration of the child to also get into the mouth of the mother also comes from a sort of like desire and fear to be eaten and to go back into his mom's body.
Yeah,
But this,
let's go back to those earlier images, sorry.
this aspiration and fear is also present in the mother's mind. And so there is a sort of like two fear and two desire that meet, but never really match or maybe misunderstand each other.
Yeah, and that strikes me about this whole series is that there are these sort of shifts in power and submission and dominance. In some of them, the mother looks to be like attacking or devouring the child. She has really sharp teeth, I think, in that other one. And in some, the child seems to be the one, you know, leading things. So I love that sort of reversal of power that you play with. But I wanted to ask you about the way you're representing the mother's face, because in some of these, there's this really delicate and precise way that you show the baby's figure, like in this one. And then the mother herself becomes sort of monstrous, or in one case, I think the painting is called Who Care? The face is just totally absent and it's just marked with these sort of colored splotches of acrylic paint. So how were you thinking about sort of representing the figure of the mother here?
I mean, the mother is a monstrous topic. We all feel uncomfortable with it. Being mother, I feel uncomfortable with motherhood and being with mother being a topic, but I also feel uncomfortable around my own mother. And of course, we are all children of women, and this is something nobody can try to avoid. And maybe there is some kind of like undealt emotion regarding to that. And it feels like as when you become a parent, you become a child again too. And you are confronted sometimes actually very violently to your own children emotion. And while I was working on this days of work, of course it happened too. Sometimes I'm the child and sometimes I'm the mother, and sometimes I don't even know who I am anymore. I'm not even sure I'm a woman.
Right.
You know, like how much does motherhood affect the perception of your own gender is also a question I was genuinely asking to myself.
Great. Well, we are running short on time, so why don't we go to Q&A? Akwetey, if you want to turn your camera back on, and I will read out some questions. Thank you. So let's start at the beginning here. Okay, so now we're going back to gross fatigue with this first question. How did the decision to use an imaginary interface for the desktop windows come about? Were those deliberately coupled with the Mac OS interface of the desktop? There's a tension between the real desktop space and an artificial one that I'm curious about. That's from Maya Livio.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question, because it's something I was very conflicted about, whether to use a real like desktop and to record myself, and I mean to kind of play it as a performance, or to completely reconstruct the desktop. And in case I would reconstruct the desktop, what age of the computer I would use and what type of digital design. In the end, I decided to reconstruct everything because it would allow me to have much more control and to retouch everything. Also because, as we discussed a bit before with Akwetey, there was a lot of back and forth between the editing, like the image process and the soundtrack process. Because when we recorded with Akwetey the soundtrack, initially we had written the poem was written with Jacob Bromberg and was a 25 minutes long poem. And so originally I started to edit with this poem in mind. But then once I had the actual soundtrack recorded by Akwetey with his performance, it also became more clear that, you know, we had to edit, and that also with the soundtrack, sometimes we changed it, we edited it, and then it went back, and then but I started to edit the film without the soundtrack, because that was actually the way to ensure there was a structure of the image of their own. But that's also why we decided to construct completely the computer. And I use a sort of old interface. It's interesting, somebody noticed, but it's not completely exactly the replica of an old interface, but it's because for me, my dad was working in the telecom company, you know, with the Minitel when I was a child. And I was very fascinated by this shape of window with the cross that the Minitel, which is the ancestor of the computer, had. So I wanted to reproduce this type of window. Also, we added this element that nobody sees, but there is actually a movement. When you look at your computer and you open a window, the gray is always gray, it doesn't move. But in gross fatigue, the window have a texture that is very, very transparent. It's kind of like, sometimes it's sun, sometimes it's a snake skin, sometimes it's another animal skin, and we layer different type of texture, and so it moves.
Right. Oh, Camille, you're frozen. Well, let's jump to the next question. Oh, there you go. Okay, so this is a question for both of you from Jose Cuevas. He says, hello, Camille and Akwetey. Thank you so much for sharing your thought and creative process and collaboration. I was wondering about the giving access to your gross fatigue through the internet as a not ideal way of delivering your work to the audience, and the breast pumping watercolor pieces you spoke about. Would either of you be willing to wonder aloud about similarities or differences or tangencies you could envision between both bodies of work, or even between those pieces in your collaboration, as a way of relinquishing control in the way something is delivered, and the way that could impact the experience of the viewer? So I think this question is basically about issues of control throughout all of the works that you guys talked about, and finding that balance between you know, intention and the way things are received by your audiences and so on. So take that where you will.
Yeah, well, or Camille, did you want to mention anything?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, thinking about any connections between our work, I would say that in kind of getting to experience Camille's work and thinking about mine, what I would say that there are certain allowances, you know, that an artist is given. I had a conversation with a friend recently about, you know, the definition of an artist being one who accepts the unknown, and also is somewhat arrested by both this idea of the potential for tragedy or otherwise, and in that way kind of communicating to a larger narrative outside of oneself, but more in thinking about humanity. So when I think about the idea of children specifically, I think that's one time that we both relatively touch on, this idea of communicating or rendering a harsh world in the presence of, or in the thinking of, or being aware of you know, a viewer or subject, you know, or subject matter that might speak to more more youthful sense of the world, you know.
Yeah. Right. Camille, do you want to add anything, or I still want to squeeze in a couple more questions?
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so this is a great question from Michelle Millar-Fisher. She says, thanks for such a great talk, and hello, Camille and Akwetey. Can I ask how your works on motherhood have been received by audiences, curators, galleries, gallerists, collectors, Camille? It's often such a taboo subject, but it's not absent in art history. I wonder how it's received in the contemporary moment. I have seen a shift in the last year or two, post Me Too and Time's Up, etc. There's a growing appetite for works that investigate this area. And I should say how much I love this work.
Yeah, it's actually, but it's a very recent body of work, so I haven't shown it really widely. It's been published in Edit magazine and also in like a few other magazines, but we haven't exhibited it yet. Also, I mean, it's possible because it's also my fault that I was very much thinking it was not over or not ready, and so I would I always felt like I had more to say and it would develop into something else, which it did. But in the end, I'm still, it's still called system of attachment and still part of the same bodies of work. So it hasn't been exhibited so much. And it's also true that I noticed when I show this work in my studio, when I had studio visit, that I could notice the difference of acknowledgement between people, and it was actually and the discomfort sometimes. And it was actually a very interesting things to notice. I myself was never completely feeling at ease with it, but as I said, I often work with things I'm not totally at ease, so it's also part of a little masochist strategy. But it did feel like a taboo, and it did feel like an interesting taboo. Although it's present in art history, but it's always in an idealized form and rarely in a sort of like embodied, I mean actually the mind in the body.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you guys have a couple more minutes, or should we
Yeah, for sure.
That actually reminded me of a question that I really wanted to ask you, Camille, and I didn't have time. This question of how you see your work fitting into kind of a legacy of feminist practices. Because for me, part of the reason why it's exciting is because it's showing sort of physical and bodily experiences of motherhood, but combining it with a kind of conceptualism of someone like Mary Kelly, for example. So I wonder, those things are often seen as these sort of separate tracks in art history. And I wonder how you see your work as sort of fitting into that.
It did feel very encouraging. I read, Mother Reader, the book of Moira Davey, which it was, I had started to make the breast palm drawings, and a friend of mine, Jenny Schlenska, who's a curator at Performance Space, she sent me an extract of Maggie Nelson text in the Argonaut about the breast palm. And then she gave me that book, The Mother Reader, and I really owe her a lot, because I think that I was working on it, but I was working on it a bit with shame and with anger and unexpressed emotion. I mean, emotion that I would express only in the drawings, but having words really helped me. And the communication with like other women who had reflected on that topic was like super helpful and important to me.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, I think we're over time. So Akwetey, if you want to pop on just for one more second, and we'll say goodbye. Akwetey, did you want to turn on your camera real quick? Okay, well, maybe he's disconnected. Anyway, I just wanted to reiterate that Gross Fatigue is visible for a few more days on our website, so please check it out. And thank you so much, Camille, for joining us today. We're very grateful, both for the permission to screen the work and for your time today. And Akwetey as well. I think we lost him due to a tech glitch at the last minute, but we had him for a good amount of time, so that's great. So that's it. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for watching.
Thank you, Marina.
Yeah, talk to you soon.